Now, why? Since I've already referenced Isaiah 61, and in Luke 4:18, Jesus essentially just quotes it, this passage from Isaiah 61, why do I take a few minutes and talk specifically about Isaiah 61? Because context, context, context. When we work on interpreting the Bible, we want to pay attention to context, historical context, literary context. These things make a difference. Grammatical context, they make a difference in the way we interpret the text. And it may not be everything that drives interpretation of the text, but it's certainly an important thing for interpreting the text. So you remember that I gave you a brief history of the exile. And I talked about the idea that there were 3 Isaiahs. Now, some disagree with that, and that's fine. Some think that Isaiah in itself is just a unity that was produced by this author, Isaiah of Jerusalem, in the 8th century BC. I think there probably were 3 Isaiahs. One that was Isaiah of Jerusalem, that is responsible for the bulk of Isaiah chapter 1 to 39. Then a second person who writes in the spirit of that Isaiah during the time that the Jewish people were in Babylon. And we call that the exilic period, or the time of the exile, the exilic period. And so we call that guy second Isaiah. And the chapter divisions are essentially chapters 40 to 55. And then we talk about this third Isaiah. And those chapter divisions are 56 through 66, the end of the book. And in the language and in the things that this writer focuses on, the idea that there's this great hopefulness in the period of second Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55, and if you read it, right, there's hopefulness in there. But in 56 to 66, it seems now contextually, kind of reading through the text or behind the text, right? It's the question behind the question. Why is this writer saying these things? What's driving that? And so it seems that there's some despair and disappointment. And so the writer, one of the things that we see, I believe we see in chapters 56 to 66, is rising above the disappointment of the day. Okay, so in 40 to 55, the writer's saying, we're hopeful about this reinstallation of a Davidic king, that is, a descendant of David. And that king will get us back on track. Third Isaiah seems to be saying, well, that didn't work out. Those leaders that we hoped would arise, that Davidic king we hoped would arise, didn't. And now we have to deal with the disappointment in that. And so it takes all of that tradition, Isaiah's kind of tradition before, and say, you know what we need is a heavenly Messiah. One upon whom, one that only he could actually fix this thing. So that's how I think about it. And so there's that hopefulness coming out of disappointment that is focused on a bigger answer to the problems that remain. And so that's why Isaiah 61, talking about the context, is important. Jesus, when going back to the New Testament now, is that heavenly answer, right? In the Christian tradition, my tradition, that's the way we think about it. This new kind of leader emerges upon whom the Spirit descends and remains, right? So the Spirit of God remains upon Jesus, and then the disciples, unlike what happened in the Old Testament. We can talk about that. And it becomes a way, when Jesus enters upon the scene, of dealing with the disappointment that didn't go away in the 6th century BC, or the 4th century BC, or the 2nd century BC, and now the Romans are in the land and they've overtaken us. And so we're back in our homeland, but it's like we're exiles where we live. And that would be weird, right? I'm an exile in my own country. And that brings a kind of angst, a kind of national angst, a kind of ethnic or cultural angst. And Jesus is dealing with that in the synagogue in Nazareth as he launches really full bore into his public ministry. And it's built on that hopefulness that arises out of disappointment in the Isaiah tradition. And it seems to me that there's a lesson there for us about hopefulness. Even though we're talking about suffering this week, hopefulness is in spite of, in some ways, suffering. And suffering isn't just, I want my toothache to stop. I kind of know that's going to happen. And I'm uncomfortable, but uncomfortable in some pain, or I have a broken leg. That kind of pain, it's temporary. It's the other that is much more pervasive and permanent. And how do you and I deal with that ourselves, and with and for? We talked about compassion, suffering with others. How do we do that with them and for them? And then what is our role in hopefulness? And how do we make sure that hopefulness doesn't extend and become false hope? And these are some things that we've talked about before and we'll continue to talk about. But Isaiah 61, for me, because Jesus references it in Luke 4, is important for my conception of what suffering really is. And again, I think it's in the head, in the heart, the whole existence. All right, so we come back in just the next lecture, which for you might be 2 days. For me, it's about 20 seconds. And we're going to talk about Acts chapter 10. I'll see you then.